Moving on to next file with functions, it will be router.ts. In here we have a function with the name normalizePageHash, which is a pretty interesting use case for us to test because this will be different from all other tests we have written before. Because as we can see in here, we are referencing object called Windows, which only exists when this function is executed in the browser environment. So we will have to find a way to provide this object in a Node.js environment to be able to test this function. We're going to talk about implementation details of this function a little bit later, and for now, let's create a new file with tests where we're going to write scenarios for functions inside router.ts. The first thing, as always, I'm going to import function it from the Vitest library and describe a couple of testing scenarios. The first scenario will be testing the function normalizePageHash when we're going to provide valid page hashes. And the second scenario is going to test that same function, but in this case we're going to provide invalid page hash. So now let's consider in more details the implementation of the function we're about to test. The idea of this function is to extract page hash from the address bar, and in case the page hash is invalid, this function is going to replace invalid hash with a valid one. Let's say we have our application running on localhost on the port 5173, and the hash determines which page should be initially opened. For example, if we'll specify timeline, that means timeline page should be opened. In our particular case, there are only 3 valid page hashes. All of them are described by this enumeration page name. So the valid hash can only be equal to timeline, activities, or progress. So if we're going to provide valid page hash, that means we're going to get into this if conditional, and eventually this function is going to return valid page hash, extracted out of the hash from the address bar. But let's say if we'll provide invalid page hash, we're going to skip this if conditional and execute the rest of the code where we're going to reset invalid page hash by assigning valid page name, in this case timeline, to the hash, and eventually we'll return valid page name. Actually, this function has been taken out of the context, and it might not be fully clear, but to us it doesn't really matter that much in order to test this function. So let's just start writing implementation for our tests. But the moment I'm going to call normalizePageHash function from within the test, in the terminal we're about to get such error. That is because all tests are executed in Node.js environment, which doesn't have window object. This is exactly what the error is saying because we were referencing window object on this line, trying to fetch hash of the page. So for such cases, in order to test those functions that are dependent on some browser APIs, like in our case, we need access to the window object. We have several libraries which allow us to mock browser environment in the Node.js environment by providing all objects available in the browser. So I'm going to go with HappyDOM library to mock browser environment. First things first, let's copy over this command to install this library. I'm also going to use flag_d because this dependency is only going to be needed during testing and not gonna be used in our production code. Once this is installed, in order for us to specify which environment Vitest should use to execute our tests, we just have to place the following comment at the beginning of the testing file: Vitest environment followed by the name of the library we used to mock browser environment. So after doing this, if we'll check tests again, this time we didn't get that error. That is because window object is now available, and if we're gonna print this object in the terminal, we're going to see this output with all available methods and properties on the window object. So now let's think how we can test normalizePageHash function. The first thing what this function is doing is it tries to extract the hash of the page. So we have to kind of arrange the world before executing this function and assign some string to the hash property of the location object. So in here I'm going to assign valid page name timeline to the hash property like so. As a reminder, valid page name can be one of the following three values: timeline, activities, or progress. And then we'll just have to compare the return value of the normalize page hash function with the hash that we expect. In this case, we're expecting it to return timeline hash. Since timeline is valid hash, normalize page hash function is not going to reset it. In order to avoid running any other tests, I'm going to specify only modifier to run only this one test, and it passed. So when we assigned valid page name to the hash, we ended up inside of this if conditional, and eventually this function has returned valid page hash. Just in case, I'm going to return invalid string in here to make sure that tests will fail in this case. So by executing this expression, we iterated over all objects inside of nowItems array and checked values inside page property and compared each value with provided hash. And if any page value matches the hash, that means the page hash is valid. So since we have three valid page names, I'm going to duplicate these lines a couple of times and use different valid page hashes. In the second case, I'm going to use activities page name. And in the third one, let's use progress, because those are all valid page names and the test should pass. But it's also a good idea to keep our tests clean and also from time to time do refactoring. So for example, in order not to repeat those two strings 3 times, we can iterate over page name enumeration by using values method on the object like so. This way, on each loop iteration, we're going to get page name from the enumeration in the page parameter. And then we're gonna use this parameter instead of hard-coding page name. Right here. So we're gonna do the same thing, but this time it's a little bit more concise. So let's remove these other extra lines and check test execution again. All tests have passed. But we also have to make sure that when assigning valid hash to the hash property, this function is not going to reset it because we will not reach this line. So I'm going to add an extra expectation right here and check that the value of the hash property should be equal to the initial page value that we have assigned to the hash before executing normalize page hash function. So now it's time to write an implementation for the second testing scenario. We're going to test the same normalize page hash function, but in this case we're going to supply invalid page hash before executing normalize page hash function. So this way we're going to check the second part of this function, followed by if conditional. The implementation will be pretty similar, so we can copy over the body of the first test, paste it in here, and instead of assigning valid page name, we're going to assign any string which is not valid page name. In this case, normalize page hash function should reset invalid page hash and assign valid page name, which is timeline. We're checking both cases that normalize page hash function will return string timeline as well as value of the hash property should be equal to timeline. Now before checking test results, let's remove the only modifier in order to run all tests. They are all passing. But if we're going to modify initial function in some way, and instead of assigning timeline to the hash, we're going to assign name of the activities page, right away we're going to get an error after running tests. Before finishing this lesson, let's just improve the implementation of this test function a little bit by using enumeration instead of hard-coding strings. So in here I'm gonna reference timeline element of the page name enumeration instead of using timeline string in both cases. Now let's take a look at the test results one last time in this lesson to verify their rel passing. Link to the source code of this lesson will be in the video description.